All right, let me go ahead and call tonight's work session to order. Isaac or Alex?
Yes, Mayor and Council. So this is a follow-up to the last urban renewal meeting that was held, where you all discussed the downtown storefront improvement program that you'd like to see as part of the plan. So we have both Scott and Elaine, our consultant team, on the line to walk you through what they have this evening. So just as a brief overview, they took input from that session. They also sent out that survey to all of you. And so what they've brought back today is essentially a result that reflects that feedback they received. And they're just looking for additional feedback and ideas to see how you'd like to move forward right now. So Elaine and Scott, if you want to take over, you are welcome.
Hi.
Hello, I'm Scott.
Welcome.
I'm just adjusting my volume and settings just to make sure everything's working here. Elaine's there. Good. So this whole process started with staff approaching us about designing a storefront improvement program. And then after the meeting Elaine had with you guys and the results of the survey, we discovered that perhaps the term storefront improvement program didn't describe the goals of the program desired by council. So we took a look at those survey results and we decided to develop two programs. Those programs are entitled the Business Development Program, which in the elevator speech terms would be the big brother to a storefront improvement program, because it would allow you to do things like improve not only the storefront, but if someone bought a property where they needed to not only improve the storefront, but do a remodel on the inside, you could participate in both activities if desired. And then there is the New Development Incentives Program, which would be a program that would allow you to make incentives for new development, whether that's cash or something based off of future property tax revenues or something else. That is something that we are actually here to discuss. So the biggest thing is today we need to get feedback, from council to see if you like the direction of these two programs, to answer any questions you may have. And once we know what your feedback is, if it's within reason, we will start discussing things like matches and how that will work. And we can perhaps come back with a survey on matches if we can't come to an full-on agreement on it. But if the input from council is that these aren't the right direction, we'll have to come back with something else and we can discuss matches at that point. So do you have any questions about the programs?
Scott, you might just walk through the two different programs. Would that be helpful?
Yes.
Get a nod. Yes.
So like I said just a minute earlier, the business development is like the big brother to a storefront improvement. You would determine a matching percentage and someone would come to you with a project, and at the beginning of the application process, you would meet up, you discuss the rough amount, the rough structure, and if it was something that you were interested in, things would go further, get more specific, and you would have more control over what the improvement was. But the match percentage is one of the big things here, because there are people who do 25% match on a project. So, a $10,000 project, you guys provide $2,500 or thereabouts. And there are people who do 50, 75. It's really up to what council wants and how often you want to use this program. You could have low incentives and do a bunch of these things if that's the demand, or you could have a higher incentive and only do one or two of these a year or every 2 years. But the impact of that singular project would be something going from a vacant storefront to a fully functioning restaurant, right? It'd be a much bigger singular impact. The reason it's not a storefront program is because you can do the work inside the way we've written it. So you can do demolition inside the structure to do a remodel and put in a kitchen or those sorts of things if approved by council. We've seen programs like these work in other cities of your size where they've gotten big improvements to small Main Street type businesses that have made a huge difference. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, Dainty Jewels, which city was that from?
La Grande.
LeGrand does a lot of this type of business development work. And each year they put it in their annual report. And that's why I thought that this type of program was so useful, is because I see it every year when I do their report and I say, man, they made big changes. So it's a more flexible program for the small business type people. The second program.
Let me just provide a little input on the first one, Scott, to go with what you've said. We provided, Scott researched a number of different programs and put together a list of the types of things that can be done under the program. So as Scott said, you can do exterior and interior renovations. And so that's windows, doors, awnings, expenses relating to structural improvements, seismic upgrade, code improvements, painting and preparation for painting, masonry repair and restoration, and on that list that we gave you. What you can't do is pay salaries of staff or pay those kinds of expenses that aren't leading to a capital expense. So you can pay for design work if somebody's looking to do an entire different design on the front of their storefront, but you couldn't pay health insurance for employees or anything like that. These lead to capital improvements.
You also can't pay maintenance expenses. So if someone wanted to simply clean their storefront instead of redoing it, repainting or some sort of capital expense, that would not be something that you could assist with, as nitpicky as that is.
Mr. Mayor.
Sir.
Scott and Elaine, I have a question in regards to other communities that would utilize these funds for equipment purchases. I'm thinking for like the restaurant industry with industrial kitchen equipment, walk-in freezers, things of that nature. I don't see that listed because what is listed is more infrastructure renovation. And so I'd be curious to know about asset purchasing to help. Is that something that's common, or would you recommend that we potentially not incorporate that type of language? Thank you.
It actually is common because it's so expensive, but it's understood that those stay with the building if they're purchased with urban renewal funds. So if the business goes out of business and wants to take that with them, they don't get to take it with them. It stays with the building, and hopefully it will help attract a new restaurant to come in.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the examples.
Elaine, can I just
Sorry.
follow up with that with Elaine? My understanding of a lot of contracts or leases with commercial sites is that anything connected to the building stays with the building anyways.
Yes.
I've talked to a lot of people that have moved out of places, had things connected, and they didn't realize it was in the contract that when they plumbed that in and connected it, that the landlord now owned it. So I assume that we'd have that same type of language.
That's great input.
So one of the examples of this, and it's exactly what you were saying, is that there was a grant to buy a brick oven for a pizza place. Expensive equipment for a restaurant. And, that's why it's the big brother to storefront improvement, is because you're able to do more to help the small businesses in your city.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
I'll turn on my camera too so you can see, but Elaine and Scott, I had a question for you. So walk me through this process a little bit. Say somebody I'm a business owner, say I want to, apply for this match. How does that process work? And then how does us as a council, or as a committee, how do we make those decisions? And can we be biased about what gets approved, what doesn't? Is it a blank slate? How does it work?
So the ultimate selection will always be up to you. You can approve or disapprove of a project based on what you want. The more successful programs that I've seen in terms of getting people in the door and trying to get things done have a very, very low energy startup on the application process. Coos Bay says, call us, we'll set up a meeting, come in, give us the rough outline of what you want to do. We'll talk about it. If we like it, we will start a more formal application process. But that is a way to get people in the door and get them interested without having to do a big application just to have council and say, this wasn't something we're interested in. So I would say there's sort of this informal application process, or if I was going to make the process, sort of the informal sit down, just getting the rough ideas. Is this what we want or not? And then there's the more formal, okay, well, how much does it cost? What's the exact design? What are the details of this so that we can make sure it's something we want?
And typically deciding it's something you want, first of all, as great as these are, most cities usually only do 2 or 3 a year, because that's all, first of all, the budget they have, and second of all, it's hard to get these businesses to come in. So you do have to work with the businesses and encourage them that doing something is good for everybody. If what they're doing is something that you don't think brings value to the area, and so we haven't talked about application process, which would be the next step. If you like the parameters of what you can do, then Scott will develop that application process for you that would establish what the procedure is and how to review and what the review guidelines are, so that you aren't stuck out there just being totally subjective to it. You do have review guidelines that specify improving the overall appearance of the urban renewal area, adding jobs, assisting existing businesses. And again, Scott will develop that, and then you'll look at those guidelines and say, well, we like these, but we'd like to add X. So like in Wilsonville, on a project we work with them on, they said, we love your program, but we want to give incentives to companies that this was for bigger ones, but to companies that provide daycare on site. And we'll give them more money if that's something that they do. So that was their thing. Every city seems to have something that they look at that and they say, hey, how about this also? So just reviewing that. So that's all in the next step.
And then I would say Sandy is only a storefront improvement program. But if you want to get an idea of how stringent you can be with what the improvement is, they have an entire design guidelines that you have to have your improvement fall within, and they will actually do a lot of the design work to make sure that any improvement they do is in keeping with the design they're trying to make for their thoroughfare. And if you look at some of the things that Sandy has done, it's incredible. They've taken these weird one-off buildings and made them into that sort of quaint mountain village look. Dutch Brothers, McDonald's, even, they have some of the guidelines on them. So that's how stringent you can be.
And
Any
this
other
is on
questions?
we're still on the business development grants, the storefront?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor,
So,
I would be also curious to know, Scott and Elaine, is there any recommendations on the grant size based on knowing our urban renewal boundaries and the number of businesses that are already established? Because this, I would see this for established businesses, or potentially new businesses that would be setting up a new lease with a facility or breaking ground for a new building. So when we look at the percentage, do we have a good idea of what amount of dollars we would have available to provide as grant dollars?
So in your budget, you have $25,000 a year going towards a program like this. Now, one of the things that I liked actually about Coos Bay's application process, besides the informal sit down, was they had a very early screener of your project has to cost around this much. And people ask why, and they told me, well, it's because projects below that don't cause the type of impact we're looking for in our program. They're too minor. So let's say that projects are around $5,000. If we're saying you only do one or two of these, maybe 3 a year, and you have $25,000 to do these projects with, a 50% match is $2,500 at something like that. You could do 10 of those, right? So even with a bigger project, a $15,000 project at only 25%, you could still do multiple of those. So again, as Elaine said, it's getting businesses to come out for this, and it's also the types of impacts you think are more important and the style you want to do. Do you want to try and get multiple businesses in with a smaller match, or do you want to do a few big improvements with a much higher match because you think that the big impact is more important than 3 or 4 stores repainting their facade and getting new window framing? That's up to you guys.
Mr. Mayor. So I'm the newest member here to City Council and trying to get caught up on just context and everything. How do we know what the percentage is of multi-tenant buildings within the city of Scappoose versus standalone single businesses? And how does that, because obviously the building owner would have to be on board. And then if it's a big building, how does that impact? Obviously it can't just impact one building. We can't just do an improvement for just one little section out of a bigger building. So how does that come into play?
So we actually have seen these types of grants and participation for one side of a building, one storefront in a building, and not the other. You're right. It would be better if both of them get improved, and if it's one property owner who owns it, you have more of a chance of getting improvements. So I think what happens is we can set up examples of this. What will really happen is when you open up your program, you'll start getting people to come in the door, and you'll realize in our city, maybe it needs to be X, but you don't really know that unless you want us to go out and interview businesses now, or until businesses start coming in and saying, okay, this is what we want to do. Does this fit in your program? And then you make minor adjustments to your program. But just setting out a base program gets people in the door. In terms of knowing the percentages of multi-tenant buildings, we don't have that information. I don't know, Alex, whether you on the staff level have that information.
Well, we have that with our business license information. Assuming
So it's
So we-
obtainable information.
I think, yes.
Yes.
Mr. Mayor.
The other thing I would say is, if we're looking at multi-use, multifamily, all those sorts of things, that could actually fall into your new development incentives depending on how you work it. Aria's behind you, Elaine.
Oh, sorry. Nighttime meetings sometimes get visitors. No.
What I would say is it really depends on what you want to do with it. Again, this new development incentives could apply to something where you have a small business that's trying to get development on top of it, or it could apply to mixed use or multifamily housing. The new development incentives is any sort of development you want. I think it was Klamath Falls. They had a urban renewal area that was formed basically because one building was going to go in and it would fund the entire urban renewal area for all the other projects. It was a $12 million building right in the middle of their urban renewal area. They gave it about 1.2 million in incentives based on the future property tax revenues, but it was a multifamily, it mixed use, it had it all, right? And that was a huge thing that they wanted, but it also gave them it almost, within the first 5 years of their urban renewal area, $12 million of increment that they could levy taxes on. So
Not quite that much, but
they're around there.
good increment.
But I mean, on top of their frozen base, they had this gigantic building,
Right.
so they could do improvements around it. And this is again where you guys can be picky with your programs and add in. You could say, well, we want an incentive if you're gonna do the top of your storefront as a mixed use or housing or something, you get X. And if you can get the other tenants to do it, then they each get X too.
Mr. Mayor.
Counselor.
So I'm just thinking through in my head here, all of our commercial building space inventory, and a lot that comes to mind is multi-tenant buildings. So to me, it seems like, the businesses can want all they want, but if their landlord doesn't sign off on it, then it's not going to go anywhere. So I would think that as we move along here and we think about our initial application or screening process too, that there needs to be some sort of layer in the very beginning that has a landlord sign off on it.
Sure.
Because, the businesses can want it all they want, but if the property owner's not down for it, it's not going to go anywhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. And we could write in, that's the first question you ask in your informal get to know you and get to know your project.
Thank you.
Any more questions on the business development program?
Doesn't look like it.
Okay, I spoke a little bit about this new development incentives program just a second ago, but this one is more of a big hitter. I live in Wilsonville in the Villebois neighborhood, and the entire neighborhood is an urban renewal area, and it's a planned community by the city of Wilsonville. They were able to request, or not able to request, they required there was an elementary school built here, and there were so many parks per block, and that every street had sidewalks. And to do that, they gave developers who were going to come in and build a bunch of houses incentives based on the future property tax revenues generated by the buildings they built. So it was a low risk way to get a lot of big things done. This area, this neighborhood went from around $500,000 in assessed value, if that, to now it's over 544 million in assessed value. And it was all with this sort of back-end incentive where you base it on whatever the future property tax revenues will be. Because of that, you can do bigger incentives with something like this. If a big building or someone comes in and says, we want to build, an apartment complex or something like that, you're able to give them something that is desirable because they have to build the building first. And that there's going to be certain amounts of income for the Urban Renewal Agency from that. It's a much more versatile and fluid tool, which is why we would recommend that if this is something you want to do, that the entire urban renewal area would be eligible for this new development, because you never know when an opportunity is going to pop up in the next 20 years that is desirable and you want to jump on. You don't know right now where that could be. So you don't want to limit yourself on that.
You did say in the meeting that we had last time that you were very interested in doing something on the property across from City Hall. So even though we suggest that you have an area-wide program, that doesn't mean you couldn't start talking to owners of particular properties or thinking about specific properties on your own to make use of the program. But it does allow for its use throughout your area. And you may tell us, nope, we just want this to be site specific and we want the very first site to look at to be the, this particular one. That's fine and that's great input and we can design the program that way. So we just, and this program is very flexible because you never know really on a big project like that what kind of assistance they'll need. And so having that initial meeting and talking to a developer is the most important thing. And knowing that whatever you provide in incentives is something that does go against your maximum indebtedness. So it is one of those projects within your plan. And at this point, there are specified amounts for these different projects. Those amounts can always be adjusted or changed. But right now you have in your renewal plan suggested amounts for those, and I don't have those off the top of my head. So I think what Scott would like is to know, do you like, this seemed to get the most votes from people when we did the survey, right, Scott? And
Yes.
the interest. So do you want it just very site specific? Do you want it area wide? And what else do you want to think about here?
What I would say about site specific is absolutely, this is your program. You can make it site specific, but you can also make it site specific without actually writing that in the program. Because remember, council has the final say in all of this. So if the
can I
only
just-
one you want to do in the next 5 years is this specific site, that's the only one you do. But if in 10 years something comes up outside of that site, do you want to have that available?
So during the last meeting, when I was talking about the one specific property, I don't think I intended to say a program that was site specific. I just knew that property is the perfect property as an example where I think that we would like to see something developed that is pleasing to when you enter this part of the new downtown versus just an apartment building. So a commercial, and if that took a incentive grant program to get that, that's the tool in the pocket I think we were looking for. But it wasn't supposed to be just for that site. I think that any site that could, because like you said, we don't know what the future's like. We shouldn't be binding our hands to the future, but that was just the pending example because I know that the owners of the property have been looking at developing it.
That's great input.
So do we feel like we have a basic understanding of these programs, and do you feel like each individual program is headed in the right direction, and would you like us to pursue more specific details on perhaps the application process and to give you some information maybe on what matching percentages would look like? I could run some rough numbers on if you did a 25% match, this is the amount of improvements, what that looks like. Does it look valid to you? How many improvements do you think are going to happen in a year? And given that you know that you have budgeted $25,000 a year, doesn't mean you have to spend it. Most cities we work with bank that money so that if they have a huge project in year 5 that they can fund it.
Right.
But it would be, I think, beneficial to have just some information on how many you could do with certain matching points, what that would look like, and it might be
So, Scott,
useful
can
to do a survey afterward.
I take a step back real quick. I was just running this as a normal work session and it's actually supposed to be an urban renewal meeting. So why don't we take a step back and do all the steps of the agenda? I apologize. You get so used to 6 o'clock work sessions. So we did call it to order. Roll call. All members of the commission are present with the exception of Commissioner McHugh, who is excused. I have a approval of tonight's agenda. A motion by Commissioner Haugen. Is there a second? Second by Commissioner Miller. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor state by saying aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Public comments. Is there anyone that'd like to comment on the urban renewal? Seeing none, let's move to the approval of minutes, September 7th, 2021 minutes. Do I have a motion? So moved. Hearing a motion by Commissioner Haugen. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Commissioner Greisen. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor state by saying aye. Opposed? Motion carries. All right, it's back on you. New business.
Very good. So yeah, I think what Elaine and I are looking for is the general approval of we like where the programs are headed. We've read them. We want the ability to do the things that these programs will allow. And then I think it might be better to get feedback from council about match percentages after this has had some time to sit. And maybe we could even give some examples of projects that have happened around the state in these types of programs to give you an idea of what other cities have been doing in terms of their match percentages, especially new development incentives. That's one that's tricky to understand even if you want a fixed match for something like that, or if you want to be able to negotiate each individual project. It's more fluid, but it's more flexible. And it's a little more work, but the people who are applying for something like this are more serious and they're going to come to the table
Right.
ready to negotiate.
And they're more sophisticated because they're typically a builder or a developer, so they already know, and what they're probably looking for is some gap financing. So something that will fill the gap between what's affordable and what's not affordable. Or if you've got requirements for sidewalks or for off-street improvements that maybe the city through the Urban Renewal Agency picks up some of the part of the cost of that. So a lot of times those negotiations just depend on what kind of project it is, what the requirements are, what kind of gap there is to make the project affordable, profitable.
Mr. Mayor, have you seen any cities do different criterias, like based on our priorities as council for different types of improvements, maybe the percentages change and what we will match, contribute?
Absolutely.
So that
Absolutely.
might be something for council to think about too, based on our priorities for what we want to see happen within the city, that we maybe adjust those contributions based on our priorities.
That's
for
a great
instance,
idea. And go ahead, Scott.
If you want for the new development sort of program, if you want a certain type of development coming in, affordable housing, multifamily, mixed use, whatever, you could use it almost like a point system. And you could score it and then be like, well, this is a 9.5 on our out of 10 scale. So you're going to get X amount of incentive. And it becomes more mathematical at that point, but it's based on your subjective criteria, which go in the direction of your goals.
Yeah, I would want it defined, just to streamline it when it comes to decision time, is my vision of it anyway. I just think that there's value in accomplishing what council wants to accomplish within the city by prioritizing those different projects and related contributions, if that makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense. I think that is something where we would need input, and I could send out another survey with some of these other things where it had write-in votes for the types of things that different counselors would want to see incentivized heavier than just a standard project. And that would give us information on what types of things we should look at and get input from council as a whole on what their opinion was.
Mr. Chair, I'd like permission to be excused to speak at the school board meeting.
I do like the Commissioner Miller's suggestion of some sort of ranking system on projects.
Mr. Mayor, may I make a suggestion? Just in the interest of efficiency and saving time, I'm wondering if Counselor or Commissioner Hagen, I didn't know if you're
No, go ahead.
talking. I'm wondering if it might be a better use of time for us to task staff with coming up with, I mean, I think staff knows our priorities and what we generally want to see within the city. But I'm wondering if it might be a better use of time for staff to come up with these different packages as a presentation to us. Otherwise, I don't know how your group is going to come up with those. I feel like staff has a better idea of what our expectations are versus an outside group. No.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed.
I'd ask for get feedback from you.
Peter, could you closer to the microphone?
Sorry. If we could get a little bit of feedback from you, two of the programs that are kind of different, but I think that both communities have been happy with are Astoria, where they've really moved the needle in their downtown, primarily through paint and those sort of projects to improve those businesses. And there's some great picks in here. The other is Sandy, which the look they went for was kind of a Timberline Lodge look. That was what they were hoping to get. I don't know. Some people, they got there, I guess. But that's generally, it's a more expensive program and it would take more staff targeting. Is there one of those programs that you would find more attractive, understanding that if we were to come up with, if you were to prioritize a program like Sandy, we would have to try and figure out what the aesthetic was for Scappoose.
Right.
So that would be very helpful as far as the improvement portion.
May I comment on that real quick? Because it's right in line with what Mr. Watts said. So when I was talking about the contribution of the match funds or whatever, I was thinking that maybe we can have those different types of improvements, like paint might be one where we contribute less or more, who knows? But there could be different levels of improvement and we could contribute differently based on what we view as what we really want to see. So just for clarification on what I meant when I said that.
Mr. Mayor. Sir. Scott and Elaine, this is Joel Haugen. So, I would like to focus on something we can make sure we can get done, or at least have a reasonable expectation of it, and and make a cautious approach. But I would also like to leverage your expertise and experience in this, because you have much broader experience than we do, and knowledge and so forth. So, maybe working with staff and our excellent planning group or crew here is come up with a list of what elements you see would be the best fit, in our current circumstances as we launch into this. And my personal preferences for storefront enhancements, that just the overall look as Peter alluded to. So, but if you kind of gave a list of things based on your expertise and our local expertise, what would make sense for us from your perspective, and then we can go from that and have kind of a good matrix to work from.
Yes, we can absolutely do that. And I think when Scott was reviewing the programs, I think he felt like Coos Bay's program was the type of program that would work well for you. So it's similar to the Astoria one, but it's, Astoria did the Fort George Brewery, which was a huge program with them with hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it did provide a huge impact. Astoria I've just been working with them over the past years on doing those smaller kinds of things that also make a big impact. But Coos Bay, that's their bread and butter. They do lots of those. They have 2 different urban renewal areas.
You doing okay?
So,
No, I'm good.
I think
Appreciate it. Thank you.
what we will do is work with staff, and we'll go back to that kind of Coos Bay model, which we think fits you really well, and talk about doing those priorities and percentages from that, and outlining a bit for you on what an application would actually look like and what the whole, the process would look like. Does that
And
sound good?
I
That
do want to
does.
ask one clarifying question. When speaking of specific qualities of a project, getting different amounts of aid, is that in reference to both programs or just the new development incentives? Because I think, as Elaine and I have mentioned, one of the biggest hurdles in sort of these storefront and business, small business developments is getting people in the door. And sort of the more complicated they see this process as, even if it's looking at something where there are, 10 different qualifiers for their grant percentage, it may intimidate people off. But again, when you look at these new development projects who are very sophisticated, they don't have any intimidation at looking at something like this. I mean, in Wilsonville, they have something called the WIN program. And it's a very mathematical thing where you apply, you do a pre-app, a post-app, and if you score a certain amount, they'll do your project. Right? And so that's a different level than a storefront. So do you want that level of, we're going to have tiers of qualifications for business development? And I'll leave it at yes or no for that question, because then I'll know how to write these programs.
So real quick, why don't we welcome Pete McHugh? Welcome.
Thank you. Could you hear me?
Yes, we did
Okay.
hear you. Thank you. We were
Thank you.
actually just talking about these programs, and the question, I was actually going to say, I'm pretty sure that Mr. McHugh would like to see some aesthetics put into these programs. But they were asking that question about, do we require aesthetics like Sandy? I was looking for your thoughts since you just joined.
Well, I think we do. I think we need, first of all, in my thinking, we need to come up with the theme. I think you've probably already talked about it, but whether it's adventure, recreation oriented, something on that basis, or whatever, the group decides. But then everything, kind of centers around that. Is my thinking on it. But that's all really what Elaine had explained to us in the first meeting. So I'm not sure where we are in that process, but I think we're just barely getting started. So.
Correct. I just wanted you to have the opportunity to express an opinion I knew you had on these programs, because they literally, right before you called in, had started talking about whether or not we have an aesthetic versus not. And
I certainly think we need the aesthetic, if I understand the difference. And it's a big undertaking that I think is going to be pivotal to virtually everything we do in the future.
Mr. Chair.
go ahead.
So to step back and kind of build on this, but answer Mr. Watt's question of my preference, I would rather crawl before we walk on this. The agency is fairly young, and I would rather that we keep an eye on the storefront improvements, getting the framework on how that grant application process would move forward, and then getting out the word about the opportunity for our local businesses to utilize those funds. As we develop and continue to increase our funds for the Urban Renewal Agency, I would look at potentially building out with maybe more of a themed aesthetics. But I just don't think that we're there yet. I think that Pete is right, that it'll take a lot of time and conversations for us to come up with an agreed upon theme that the community would want these dollars to be used for, that represents the face of Scappoose. So for me, I would like us to really focus in on the first grant of the, not new development, but the, business development grants, and learning more about how we could utilize that grant application process to fund potential improvements within the URA. Thank you.
also perhaps come up with um, a tiering system or priority system that focuses more on the business development of what's existing. And then were you thinking of dropping new development altogether or just more back burner item while we iron out the business development?
So I think that we need to move forward with both at the same time, especially if the new development one is based on the value of the property. We're giving them a percent of money that we know we're going to get them. And the reason is that while we're discussing aesthetics within the new development incentive program, I believe we have much more say in the aesthetics based on the grant that we're giving them. And we can, instead of, like, my concern is, I don't want to see just an apartment building go up across the street. I would really like to see commercial down below with residential on top as, a mixed use and not just apartments. And this is how we get there. We don't get there with the storefront, but the storefront is also important because we have lots of storefronts that could use help. Peter?
Yeah, I don't see what expense is involved with developing a theme. It seems like that would be the first thing we need to move forward with. I don't, the rest of it will fall into place after that as we have funds available. My biggest concern is that we just kind of monkey around and don't get anything done for the next year or 2 years, and then we're back in the same place in 2 years and thinking, well, we need to get a theme, don't we? We need to have some kind of marketing, but I think we should move forward in the most positive and positive way possible at this time.
I think Elaine and I's question would be on the theme. Sandy has a whole development and design guidelines document, right? And that's a big undertaking. That's, I think, what we were talking about. That's not something that's going to happen within a year. Now, just a theme, which is an agreed upon aesthetics from you guys, I mean, again, you get final approval, and if you're giving the incentive, you do drive some of the, well, we want it to look more like this if we're going to give this grant. It may not be a formal design guidelines and standards type of document that's there, but you definitely could have your own theme that you discuss and agree upon when looking at projects.
But the Sandy program is great. I think it's the best program in the state. However, they hired an architect who developed, like Scott said, is a full handbook for that style and different ways you can use this style. They developed design guidelines that were put into their code. The architect looked at specific buildings and did design schematics for them so that they could approach those building owners and get them to move ahead. So it was both time intensive and money expensive. It's done a fantastic job. It is the only one like that in the state that has spent that kind of energy on the design guidelines. So, if you want to do that, you can certainly go that way. Scott and I do not have the expertise to do that. You would have to hire a designer or an architect or someone who does have that expertise. If you want to go with just a storefront program to spiff up and clean storefronts and put in new windows or that kinds of thing, we can get you up and running by the start of the fiscal year. So it's just looking at what it is you want, and we can help make that happen for you.
So if I hear you right, you're saying we could do these two programs, but if we wanted to do a theme or aesthetic, that it's a much deeper dive.
It is.
That we would have to hire. Now, the city
Much more
does have a
expensive.
downtown overlay currently. Does that put us ahead of the game, I would assume, in looking at what we can tweak within that?
Sure.
Because we already got, I guess there's some aesthetic already built in. It would be more of maybe the council working on how does that aesthetic look, and how do we want to change it up to, you know, our aesthetic if we're gonna go that way, our theme. But I think that we're a little bit ahead.
Mr.
I think what Elaine's suggesting is that what Sandy did was kind of a two-part process. So they put in design a specific aesthetic for new construction that has to meet the criteria. There are other cities that Milwaukee did something similar, Dundee did something similar. You can use that process when you have a new application come in. So that can be something like the amount of glazing or windows that are on the front of it. If you want to do something similar to your existing buildings, because exactions you can only exact when they have the application in, those would need to be done through this sort of grant program. And so I guess if there's a city that there's recently been a bunch of downtown work that you're aware of that you really like the aesthetics of, probably the place to start for Scappoose and the budget and budget priorities would be figuring out what that jurisdiction is, kind of cribbing their design review process, tweaking it a bit to make sure it doesn't disincentivize things, then figuring out if there's a separate grant program that can be utilized. And what you'll see the most of are things like, these are the sort of products that cladding for buildings, be it brick or wood or in Sisters, you know, there's the Sisters aesthetic. And then as long as those are clear and objective, that can be part of the design. But if you want existing businesses to have that, mirror that aesthetic, then that would probably need to happen via a grant program. But I would expect those two things would normally happen hand in glove, because if you want the new, you can essentially make the new development adopt the aesthetic if that's in your design, and as long as it's not cost prohibitive, and it will give you that look and not and you know, they'll have that expectation going in too, because it's clear and objective. As far as themes, if I'm bold enough to suggest one, the theme of explorers. Scappoose was found by explorers. The explorers ties into the active outdoor recreation that I think is increasingly popular and something that people want to talk about tourism and that. So again, like, people have explored the gorge and maybe they've explored the Mount Hood forest, but the next closest porthole to wilderness is actually here in Columbia County. And so signaling to people that that's going to be a priority here is whether it's mountain biking or kayaking or whatever active outdoor recreation, people are no longer able to get somewhere else because of crowding. Highlighting the fact that this is a place where they could get it might be a way for you to kind of signal to them that, you know, explorers are welcome, or come explore Scappoose and Columbia County.
Thank you.
What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a whole new project.
Yeah.
Josh.
I just wanted to kind of add, you know, I think maybe this might be a good idea to also, if we have time, to maybe engage the community at the annual town meeting with some of this, especially with some possible thoughts on design work, or, you know, a theme that we want to accomplish across the board. It might be good to kind of have that as a starting point, if that's possible.
Thank you.
I do.
Pete,
Go ahead.
go ahead. Go ahead, Scott.
I was going to give just a sort of a cautionary tale. I think that a program like this would be best done with computer programming philosophy, which is to get a program out there and then iterate from learning from the application process. And I say that because before there were Wilsonville wind zones, there were Wilsonville TIF zones. They set these TIF zones up with these complicated formulas. They thought that they had the bee's knees. Did they have 4 of these areas?
5.
5. They were set for 5 years' time. Not one applicant qualified. Nothing got done in any of those zones over 5 years because the process was something that they weren't able to start with a basic, get people in the door, see what the problems were, and then iterate. Yes, the aesthetics are very important, but it seems as though having a program that can function first and then being able to really hone in on those aesthetics might be a better philosophy just in terms of functionality of this program when you really do want to move with the aesthetics. Otherwise, you're starting with this whole iterative process when you could be making a big impact. That would just be my cautionary tale and word of advice.
Yeah, and I
Thank you.
think we can work with staff on your present design overlay and see what that gives you. So maybe Alex and staff and Scott and I can just set up a kind of a working meeting. I know we had been looking towards you for a lot of the input, but if you're saying to us, okay, now we've reviewed this, we kind of like the way you're going. Now we want you to make these changes and we want you as staff to bring us something to review. I think we're all comfortable with doing that next step.
Yeah, I got you.
The Scott on the screen. Your cautionary note about the aesthetics or the theme, but it's kind of counterintuitive because if you don't have a theme, and something you're marketing, you're just floundering from my perspective, and that relates to we want a brand Scappoose, we want that theme or aesthetic, so that we can go forward efficiently.
I would say a theme is good. A design and guideline standards like Sandy is not something that is a now thing if you want it to function. I think the framework of a theme agreed upon by you guys is great. I think that marketing this and getting input from citizens and further refining is also great. But I don't think waiting until you have a document from all of that is necessarily the best direction, because I think that you could be going in the direction you want without having it formalized in a plan or a city plan or a document. That was just my
I agree with that
view on it.
concept. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So we've got to kind of wrap this up as well. We're running out of time. So it sounds like have a move forward on both these plans. You got some
Yes.
input from us. I think that the council is definitely sounds interested in discussing some sort of theme for the city. I think that'd be a good, healthy discussion for us to have.
Mr. Mayor, may I just add something? I don't think it's necessary for us to reinvent the wheel on this. If there's some things or some cities that we look at that we like Hillsborough or whatever, right? I mean, this is the way it looks is going to be, we're going to get varying opinions on it, right? It's like none of our houses are probably the same color, right? And the insides don't look the same either. But if we can find a city that maybe 3 or 4 that we all like, I mean, why can't we go get their documents and just kind of tailor it to Scappoose rather than starting from the ground up? I mean, I go to,
I think that's what we end up doing.
yeah, I default to Hillsborough because I think Hillsborough's done an excellent job with their planning and just basically their city development in a general sense. So I don't know, I just want to throw that out there that maybe that's a way to approach it.
Piggyback off that, I support that statement. Is that something that our staff would be bringing back, or is that something that Elaine and her team would be offering up? Different examples, or is that something is that on our side or is that on your side?
We would work with them to.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what we'll end up doing after this is setting up some kind of meeting where we'd sit down and actually hash out how that works and what that would look like. And then I'm assuming some of this might end up in the 50-year plan.
Identified in the that we look at downtown is something that would be baked into the community visioning.
There's
All right.
definitely some considerable
Okay.
overlap there.
So
Thank you.
You've got direction then?
Yes.
All right. There's no need for anything else. Urban renewal meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Scott and Elaine.